Hi, I'm Greg Cajete. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico, and currently I'm a professor in the University of New Mexico College of Education, Language, Literacy, and Social Cultural Studies Department, and also in the Native American Studies program. I became interested in biology because of my early childhood experiences as a farmer in my family, and also in the context of becoming interested in the natural world. And so I went to the University, or New Mexico Highlands University, to get my degree in biology. And that started my career in the sciences. My current work, I'm looking at the different aspects of native science and how native science can become a bridge into a more relevant and productive exploration of Western science. One of the most rewarding moments of my career has been really the development of two different programs, first at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and now at the University of New Mexico Native Studies program, in which we have integrated Indigenous thought and philosophy as an integral part of the curriculums in both of those programs.
Everybody, my name is Philip Chavez. I'm a senior in the Human Dimensions and Natural Resources. I'm going to give our land acknowledgement right now. So, Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties of nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly, that our funding came at a dire cost to Native Americans, Native nations, and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. Thank you.
Mabrika, welcome everyone. I'm Dominique David Chavez. I'm a PhD candidate here in the Natural Resource College, and I'm very honored to be able to welcome one of my longtime mentors, someone who's an inspiration to a lot of us Indigenous scholars and people all over the world, really. And so first I'd like to just give thanks to all of the people who allowed us to have this space, to have this seminar, the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Program, and to Kevin and Karina especially for organizing, and Marley Smith, and then also to the Native American Cultural Center staff and to the Dean of Warner College for helping to support and host this seminar. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Greg Cajete. We're so grateful that you came out to speak. He's from the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, and now is at University of New Mexico, where he was the former director of the Native American Studies program for over 18 years, and continues educating in serving as a professor in Native Studies and in the College of Education. And Dr. Cajete has worked heavily in the Southwest region, but also internationally, where he's really been a leader in transforming our education systems, and especially in developing culturally responsive curricula that's based on Indigenous understanding of our natural environment. And Dr. Cajete is a renowned author. He's written 6 books. I recommend you read all of them. This is his most recent one. We're really excited to learn that he's working on his 7th book. And he does have a few limited copies here, so afterward you could come up and support his authorship. And we're just very grateful to have you here, so I hope that you all learn and continue to be inspired as we have. And Hahom, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dominique. Senk itamo, biwo nyini, as we say among my people, Tewa. which means, good day and be with life. It's really a pleasure to be here to give this presentation and to be in such a fancy classroom. I've kind of blown away in terms of having so many monitors, but it's good. It's good. And I'm on sabbatical now for this semester, so I'm able to do more of these kinds of presentations. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to share some of my thoughts and my perspectives with you about, in this case, an ecological philosophy of native science. Of course, I do a diversity of work, both at the University of New Mexico and then also throughout the United States, Canada, and the Indigenous world, as I would call it. So I've been in many places, almost too many to remember, in Latin America, in Taiwan, in Europe, and really exploring how other indigenous peoples understand and view their relationship to the natural world, and how they engage Western education, and at the same time, are striving to create or recreate in the face of colonization their own forms of education. So my work is very broad, as one would say. I've been a active teacher for the last 45 years. Started at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm a self-taught artist, so I put myself through college partially through doing jewelry and working in that field, but also working as a, my degree is actually in field biology, but working primarily in science education, and more particularly science education as it relates to native students, native populations. So a lot of the books I've written, deal with that kind of work, and today's presentation is really one of the windows, if you will, into that world. This was my first book, Look to the Mountain: An Ecology of Indigenous Education, and it's had a life of its own. An example of the artwork that I do, some of the artwork that I do. This is the one specifically, Ignite the Sparkle, that is on science education in native contexts. And so this was my work at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, as I created culturally responsive science curriculum that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students that were attending the school. And those of you that may have not heard of the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, began in 1962, essentially as a cultural education experiment within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose focus was basically to use art as a foundation for educating young Native students who were aspiring to be artists. And of course, it's world-renowned in terms of having produced many of the contemporary Native artists that are in the field today, and continues to do that. So I do have a relationship as well with Native American, or the Institute of American Indian Arts, as well as Native American Studies. So let me get right into the presentation. A lot of times, as I go around the country, and the other book that I don't have a copy of, but someone in the audience may have, Native Science, which is a book I wrote about 2000, and it was really the content of the curriculum I had developed at the Institute of American Indian Arts. So Native Science is really about the different cultural histories of Native peoples with regard to how they express themselves, through what today we call science. But of course, Native people didn't have the word science or used the word science, as they didn't have a word for art, they didn't have a word for science. But that didn't mean they didn't do it, and they do it very well and in very elegant ways. And so I use that as a metaphor to sort of talk about indigenous thought, indigenous philosophy as it relates to the natural world. And so essentially, as the title sort of gives you a sense for, an ecology or ecological philosophy of native science, living the earth, facing the sun, and seeking the light. And so in my work, and also because I do also study native languages, you'll find that native language is full of metaphors. Metaphors are used as linguistic memory devices, and so many times the use of a metaphor, either symbolically, in the form of a visual, or in the form of a linguistic term or a story, becomes a foundation for thinking about or remembering a body of knowledge, a thought, a perspective, an understanding, an insight that becomes important for thinking about and particularly for sustaining. So you find in native languages a lot of metaphors, a lot of stories, a lot of visual descriptions of how they understand themselves, native people understand themselves in relationship to the natural world. So living the earth, facing the sun, and seeking the light. Let's see if I can work this. Okay, good. So as an artist, I use a lot of art in my presentations. And if you were to visually sort of think about what is the indigenous view, what is the indigenous worldview, which is primarily an ecological, relational worldview, how would you depict it? And so a lot of times, particularly native artists, contemporary artists, will ponder these questions, these ideas, and come up with some kind of representation, as our ancestors have always done, in symbolizing, key ideas and perceptions. And so this particular piece is a collage, and it's entitled In the Native Eye. And you can see the native eye right here. This is the artist behind this, or who did this, is Conrad House. Navajo artist. He's since passed away, but nonetheless, this is his work, his rendition of what is it that the native eye sees as the native eye peers into the world. And you can see it's a collage of interrelationships and interdependencies. It's plants and animals and natural forces interacting with each other in some very dynamic ways. So you have the eagle, the deer, the hummingbird, the turtle, the corn, all of these entities interacting in this dance of relationship, this dance of interdependence. And that's essentially as close as you can become or come to this whole idea of how can you depict interdependencies. And so through the native eye, I think, gives you a good indication of what I'm talking about. So what is indigenous thought? And some of those thoughts and ideas, so in terms of Western philosophical terminologies, okay, you have axiology, which is from the perspective of native peoples, value lies in the balance of relations. We're always concerned with balance of relations. Axiology is, what does your thinking revolve around? Epistemology, how do you come to know what you know? Through observing, doing, making, symbolizing rhythm, which is inclusive of song and dance, ritual and ceremony. The logic is all elements and beings of the multiverse, not the universe, the multiverse, are linked together. And then process is working with the understanding that all things are dependently interrelated in the harmony and balance of the multiverse. This idea of maintaining balance and finding ways to be a part of that balance. So that's essentially, from a Western lens, a philosophical lens, an indigenous or the indigenous worldview. I use this particular slides, and you'll see a lot of different slides, from my various courses that I'm using. And so this is the medicine wheel, which is up in Wyoming, and it's a medicine wheel that was around at least 8,000 years ago, being used by the peoples that are probably the ancestors of the people that were commemorated in the opening, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Ute, and probably some of the peoples in Mexico as well, and into South America. But it is a native science technological device that gauges and that predicts the movement of the sun, through its equinox as well as its solstice phases, and using what we call indicator stars, and calibrating the number of days in which the solstice can be marked, so that certain ceremonies can happen. And of course, every one of these slides is a course. You could actually, go that far and in that depth into just medicine wheels and how native peoples have used them. There's actually one here it comes as far down as the medicine bow. Right above Fort Collins here, there's a medicine wheel that is probably at least 7,000 years old. And it's up in the forest. It's very secluded, but it's there. So it comes as far as this distance. So first insights. Native science is a product of a different creative journey than Western science. Native science is a metaphor for native knowledge. It is the stories of the world that include creative ways for living and participating in relationship with the world through processes for seeking life, relationship, and meaning. So I began and introduced myself, being with life, So as you look at indigenous thought, you'll see that it's a life-centered philosophy. It's an ecological, life-centered philosophy. And so the processes and the perspectives and the ways of life revolve around that idea of relationship. And so a mountain builder, sun priest, commemorating probably on summer solstice, the coming of the sun and the coming of that special time of the sun and the beginning of certain kinds of new cycles, within the life of the mountain builders at that time. Sense, perception, and creative participation. An indigenous physicist not only observes the world, but participates in it with all his or her sensual being. Everything in nature is alive and with energy. And so human energy is an integral part of that energy of nature. And so participation with that becomes a focus. Hence the focus on ritual and ceremonies during certain cycles, keyed to certain cycles of both sun and moon. So therefore, becoming open to the natural world with all of one's senses, body, mind, spirit, is the goal of native science. So, in November, I was at a mind and body conference in Phoenix, really fancy hotel. And some pretty rich people actually attending those conferences because it was pretty expensive. But I was invited to come and to present something similar to this presentation. But what was interesting and insightful was that in many ways, native science is a mindful science. It's a mindful science, and many of the presenters at the conference were talking about exactly the same thing in terms of the practice and understanding of mindfulness as a way of understanding yourself in relationship to others and yourself in relationship to the cosmos. So there's some interesting kinds of parallels beginning to crop up Quantum physics is another place where you begin to see indigenous-like thinking and phrases and language being used. This is Chaco Canyon, and also this is Fajada Butte, and also another wonderful expression of native science. 3 slabs of stone that are on that butte, and behind those slabs of stone are 2 concentric rings, one large one, one small one, which mark summer solstice at noon, and one of the only sites in the world that does this. Again, this creative context of seeking life, is this understanding of relationship. So dynamic creativity is both the ordering principle and process of the universe. So in many ways, indigenous people, like all people around the world, are interested in tuning in, what I call resonance, developing a sense of resonance or feeling of resonance with the natural order. And so this idea of interdependence naturally leads you to think about, what is my place? What is our place in the greater order? So these are big questions that have always been a part of all sciences of human people. So the natural creativity includes both an implicate and explicate order that is in constant flux and dynamic activity. So there's an inner world and there's an outer world consistently that we carry with us. And they're both interrelated, and that's what mind and body talks about. I mean, mind and body relates that idea, in contemporary terms, using Eastern philosophy primarily, but it's also a part of indigenous philosophy as well. So chaos and order, order and chaos, complex adaptive systems, and fractal processes are expressions of this dynamic principle, which indigenous people were tuning into through their forms of science. And so Chaco Canyon is one of those places where that kind of thinking was going on. That kind of resonance was being built. So again, that sense, perception, and participation, an indigenous physicist not only observes the world, but participates in it with her central being. Everything in nature is alive. Therefore, becoming open to the natural world with one's senses, body, mind, and spirit is the goal of native science. So I say that twice, because this is a central idea, in the context of understanding what is native science. Again, so, as summer solstice is coming in Fajada Butte, the sun is getting closer to its highest point at noontime. On June the 21st, a dagger of light will start to form that cuts behind those 3 slabs and cuts directly through the spiral that's carved into the sandstone, and will mark exactly that time, that very special time. It only lasts about 5 minutes, 6 minutes, so it only lasts a certain period of time, but it captures that. We have a lot of other sites that do something similar. So once Fajada Butte was discovered, all of a sudden, there were sun daggers being discovered all over the Southwest. So, what is the native mind? My new book is called The Native Mind Rising, and it's an anthology of the work of some of my graduate students as they develop their own indigenous curriculums, and so I'm going to anthologize a few of them. But it's about the native rising of the mind. So it reveals that through abstract symbols, spatial, sound, reasoning, kinesthetic expression, and various forms of creative, ecological, integrative, and spiritual thinking. So when you really study indigenous thinking, you're studying a lot of these kinds of human cognitive processes interacting with each other. So this is why native science is expressed through story, through art, through song, through ritual, through music, through community, through hunting, through fishing, through farming, through healing, through architecture, and through astronomies. Because you need multiple modes of expression. So language alone doesn't do it. Language can reveal it and can reflect it to some extent, but you also need these other mediums to be able to get the full breadth of this way of understanding. So art and science, share a lot of thoughts and ideas and perspectives. As an artist, I also wanted to study how do art and science as creative processes parallel each other, and they do very, very, very profoundly, and certainly do that in native contexts. So there's a creative process in the creation of art that is imbued with a spirit and a power to it that used to be the way you created art in earlier times, and certainly was the way you created traditional forms of art. So there's a period of preparation, which includes many things, prayer, ritual, dance, song, adherence to natural patterns. Certain patterns are distinct to certain places. Certain designs are distinct to certain places, certain characteristics of places in which Native people live. So those were depicted, those were understood, those were remembered and were portrayed. Polychromatic time means that time is not just linear, but that there's multiple dimensions of time, and the time that it takes for something to happen is when it's ready. So it's not going on clock time, it's not going on, the time is inclusive of natural cycles, time when certain things are happening in a natural cycle. Hence, focus on solstices and equinoxes and when's the best time to do certain things and when's the important time to do certain things. Setting the right place and right intent. It was a part of intrinsic, well-practiced belief, so that the whole community knew those symbols, knew that process. And hence there's very particular kinds of traditional art forms for each tribe that are very uniquely that tribe. And then, of course, packing the symbol incorporated meditation, mindfulness. And then finally the giveaway, the visual, waiting for it to be born as you would. To give away and to appreciate its meaning in the context of a community. So art was more than just hang at the wall, decorative. So the tenets of Native philosophy include, and I should go back to this slide. This is also in Chaco Canyon, Casa Rinconada. It is as close to a perfect circle as you can create using just your body as the measurement system, which is what they did. And it's aligned. It's also another kind of sun technology. It's aligned with the solstices as well. And north and south, east and west. Oh, I'm going backwards. So, tenets of Native philosophy: spiritual agency, perpetual dynamic dimensional harmony, all knowledge related to creation or perpetuation of the natural world. Everything has spirit. All is related. Everything in every place has a role. So everything is important. Everything is important. Mutual reciprocal behavior. Everything has a history. Listening, dialogue, appropriate technology, context, dreams, patterns, cycles, elders, ritual, knowledge, initiation, story, observation, and renewal of life are all characteristics of this kind of thinking. Another example of another kind of sun instrument. This one is located in Hovenweep, Utah, right on the Four Corners area. This is a sun tower, and it captures what the sun dagger captures at noon in Chaco Canyon. It captures the same thing as well as the equinoxes, but now using a different kind of structure. So, you don't do these kinds of structures if you don't invest the time and energy, into this kind of, if you're not intimately interested, and if this is not intimately important to your understanding of self and your understanding of your place in the world. So indigenous science and indigenous knowledge. So what is indigenous science? So this is my definition. It's a multi-contextual system of thought, action, and orientation applied by an indigenous people through which they interpret how nature works in their place. In their place. Indigenous knowledge is a high context body of knowledge built up over many generations by a culturally distinct people living in close contact with the place. Its plants, its animals, its waters, its mountains, and its deserts. And of course, this particular picture or painting represents the many hundreds of stories that different tribes have that convey these ideas of native science and native perspective. So that's why the story, the oral tradition becomes so important in this kind of thinking about science. So these are the epistemological characteristics of native science. It's primarily oral transmission. It has always a practical orientation. So besides having these very philosophical, ecological resonance with the natural order and cosmic order, native science was also very practical, okay? Because at the end of the day, native science is a form of science which sustains, or which is designed to sustain people in place, in time, through generations. And so that was the kind of the ultimate mandate, for native science, is to be able to do that. So, observation over generations, cyclic orientation. This is why we have, among all tribes, ceremonial cycles that are calibrated to the year. Specific cultural, literary style and symbolism. So each tribe, had their own way of describing this. Some emphasize dance, some emphasize artistic representation. Some, like the Chacoans, emphasize architecture and architectural alignments. The Valley of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Sun. There's one both for the sun and the moon. So this is the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan. So different tribes in different ways, created a body of knowledge and understanding and ways to convey this knowledge, and also along with this, particularly in Mexico and Central and South America, a whole mathematical system that paralleled that. So conservation of knowledge through time and generations. So that was the operational, mandate of native science. So protocols in native science are also a part of this. So indigenous science integrates a spiritual and ethical orientation to interactions with nature. So there are protocols for almost everything, especially in terms of establishing, maintaining, and continuing a practice of relationship that humans have to things that are natural. A dynamic, multi-dimensional harmony is a perpetual state of the universe. So there's the recognition that everything is always in flux, everything is always changing, everything is always in movement. And so Native people tried, in their forms of science, in their ways of looking at the natural world, to be in that flow, to understand how that flow, or to try to understand how that flow worked in their place and in them, and in that process, felt and established a very deep and intimate resonance or connection to the places in which they lived, to its plants, to its animals, and also a deep sense of community, that extended not only to the human community, but to everything around them. So humanity, this idea that traditional knowledge is related to guiding stories of emergence of humans into the world. So every tribe has a creation myth or an emergence myth. And for the tribe, that's the key story. That story in all its iterations and at all its levels contains the basic plan, okay? That's the map from a psycho-spiritual traditional perspective. That's the map for that tribe, for that people. And that's why the emergent stories are so important to Native peoples. Are continued. So one of the first reclamations, of traditional knowledge usually begins with the reclamation of the traditional stories of origin. Indeed, some of those stories have been lost, among some tribes because of colonization, and other tribes have adapted in those cases to try to adapt different parts of other stories and recreate and reconstruct those stories in ways, that are contemporary and make sense for them today. So there's also the idea that humanity has an important role in perpetuation and sustainability of natural processes in the world, which means humans can't just stand and say, "Here I am," and this is what's happening in nature. It's not that kind of relationship. So as you think about these dynamics, these protocols, think about your roles in this process as well. All things of the world are animate and have spirit, which means they have significance. There's a significance to every place because each place reflects the whole order of nature. So every place requires respect. The history of a place must be respected with regard to places, its animals, its plants. Each place has a spirit, a story, which must be considered and respected. That's why the indigenous peoples are asking for recognition of the place in which you are at. That's the essential reason for doing that, is to remember that others have been here before. Others have lent their spirit, their blood, their sweat, their tears to the places in which they live. And that deserves respect. Technology used should be appropriate and reflect balanced relationship with the natural world. So technologies are not just tools, that technologies also have a spirit to them. And if you don't respect that spirit, you're going to get in trouble pretty quick. And there are stories that talk about that. The Huichol emergence myth talks about their cultural hero, and he gets mad at his axe because the axe is dull and not cutting away the brush fast enough. So he throws his axe away, but his axe has revenge the next day by by causing all the plants to grow back again. And so the story goes on and on, but you know, it's a story of remembering that everything, artifacts, you know, are alive, have spirit, and have to be used properly with respect. So otherwise they have revenge. So application of science in a native context. So now we're switching to what does this mean to science education and to science, working in science, people working in science. Application and policy evolves from the need to sustain the well-being of both human and natural communities through time. So these are kind of mandates that I think need consideration as you begin to look at the big picture of what do you do science for? Any kind of science. What do you do science for? And in addressing that issue, these are some considerations. Application reflects a cultural view of a people. So that culture matters. There's this notion and myth, you know, that science is acultural. You know, you can read this in the textbooks. Science is acultural. Absolutely no human system of knowledge is acultural. Every system of human knowledge has a cultural history to it. Nothing that we do as human beings is without culture. And so those are the ideas that have to be, I think, addressed. So application sustains the life of a natural place. Policy is based on participatory, community-based research in which the community, which is inclusive of the plants and the animals, should have some kinds of rights or say in what's happening in that place. Science and technology or research is applied with minimal impact on a human and natural community. How would you think science would change in terms of its current expression, as all of you know it, if you would actually begin to apply some of these principles to what you actually do and how you actually form and look at policies? It has a transformative quality to it. I guarantee you that if we took any one of these policy dictums, you know, from an indigenous perspective, and applied them to widespread policy development, that would significantly change many of the kinds of policies and activities and behaviors that we have. So this is the intent, you know, for bringing forward the indigenous science thought. So this is, I know a lot. I'll try to read it, you know. Incidentally, this is all coming from Native Science, the book that I don't have. But you can get this on Amazon. It's back in print. So I'll read some of it. An ecological or eco-philosophy that includes life orientation in contrast to language orientation, commitment to nature, values, and as opposed to detachment and objectivity, focus on spiritual vitality in contrast to academic spiritualism. You know what academic spiritualism is? You know, we venerate our institutions like they're churches. You know, it's a kind of psychology that we moderns, you know, tend to gravitate to, you know, where we venerate the knowledge but not the people from which that knowledge comes. We venerate the knowledge but not the place from which it comes. So that's what academic spiritualism is. So an attempt to gain comprehensive understanding rather than piecemeal analysis, pursuit of wisdom. Oh, that's a big one. Pursuit of wisdom rather than accumulation of data. Reorientation of economics towards a holistic quality of life rather than an increase in GNP. I had the pleasure and honor to be a part of a group of educators that went to the nation of Bhutan a few years ago, about 10 years ago. in which we explored what would a gross national happiness curriculum look like? How could it be done? What would it be based on? What views would, and what kind of students would it produce? And how do you teach for it? So this is not new. I mean, there are experiments in the world where these ideas are actually being explored in a very direct and vital way. So, a political orientation that truly focuses on the greater good rather than on financially endowed special interests. A cultivation of social and individual responsibility rather than individualistic autonomy. Such an eco-philosophy honors cultural cosmologies as well as developing a deeper inner consciousness of health as the foundation for outer transformation of self, community, and society. So these are actually a synopsis of the words and philosophy of Heinrich Sklimowski, who was a Polish eco-philosopher and who's been doing this kind of philosophy work for the last 35 years. So even eco-philosophers, in the Western tradition, are coming to these ideas and these perspectives. So it's a part of our literature as well. So what would an eco-education look like? Because when you talk about philosophy, philosophy remains contemplating your navel unless you find some practical applications for it. Okay, so indigenous people took their philosophy, but they applied it also in very elegant ways. So if we were to do the same, what would that look like? Eco-philosophy seeks to integrate values with the worldview in a direct, ecological, informed way that mirrors the level of integration once achieved by indigenous peoples. Just as new forms of life are evolutionary, created out of older forms, so new forms of knowledge and systems of learning must be created out of the most promising spiritual and cultural heritages of the past, which much of our collective heritage is worth saving. There is much that is superior, creative, wise, and already ecologically sophisticated. And eco-education would draw from these knowledges, understanding, and creative thinking of the past, the present, in order to prepare for a sustainable future. So this is the case for multiculturalism in science, because every culture does have forms and traditions of science, which have not really been studied that much unless you're specifically researching those kinds of traditions. So thinking about those implications, I think are very important. So just to finally finish this, native science has always been this broad-based ecological philosophy. It's not based on rational thought alone, but incorporates the fullest degree of all aspects of man in nature. That is, the knowledge and truth gained from an interaction of body, mind, and spirit. Again, mindfulness is now coming and saying the same thing. In process, reflection, and practice, native science embodies the natural system characteristics of diversity, optimization, cooperation, self-regulation, change, creativity, connectedness, and niche. Because a lot of what you see in native philosophies, native senses of ecologies are in many ways mimicking nature. It's based directly on how nature actually works in its most elegant expressions in natural communities. And so that's what you're seeing when you see or hear about natural or indigenous philosophies. So almost finished, guys. I know this is death by PowerPoint, right? So, well, hopefully PowerPoints make sense. So, native science integrates a spiritual orientation. So this is the review. Dynamic, multidimensional harmony is perpetuated, is a perpetual state of the universe. So understanding that is true, that is the case, that everything is in flux. All human knowledge is related to the creation of the world and the emergence of man. Therefore, human knowledge is based on human cosmology. Humanity has an important role in the perpetuation of all natural processes in the world. Everything is alive, animate. There's a significance to each place, and each place reflects the whole order of the nature. A history of relationship must be respected with regard to the places, the animals, the plants. Technology should be appropriate and reflect on balanced relationship. There are basic relationship patterns and cycles in the world that need to be understood, and this is the proper role of mathematics, because as you know, mathematics is integrally tied with science in some way, but in modern expression, science is over here, mathematics, although, you know, they've been separated out, you know, and in earlier times you couldn't separate mathematics from science. You know, they were integrally a part of each other, and not so much so today. There are stages of initiation to knowledge. Elders are relied upon as keepers of that knowledge. Acting in the world must be sanctioned through ritual and ceremony. Properly fashioned artifacts contain the energy of the thoughts, the materials, and contexts in which they were fashioned, and are therefore symbols of those thoughts, those entities, and those processes. So what you create creates you as much as you create it. So be careful about what you create. Dreams are considered gateways to creative possibilities if used wisely and practically. So that's kind of the indigenous mandate, you know, and as we look at native science, you know, we begin to see that that it creates maps of the world that are coming from an indigenous viewpoint of interdependence and interrelationship. So we are also looking at maps, you know, when you look at native science. Coming to knowledge, coming to know of native science revolves around natural creative processes of human learning. What's interesting in my research of all of this over these 40 years has been that many of the things that indigenous people were doing and are doing and did in terms of forms of traditional learning and teaching are now coming back as a result of all of the research that's going on in terms of how humans actually learn based on brain cognitive studies that are going on worldwide in terms of how we actually learn, how we actually internalize ideas and perspectives. I'm sad to say that much of our contemporary current norms in teaching are not only outmoded, they're actually, in some cases, prevent learning rather than facilitate learning. So it really is an eye-opener to really read some of the new cognitive research and its implications for education and the way that we do education and teaching and learning. So continual emphasis is placed on being of nature, or working with the natural flow, or listening and looking closely and consistently practiced behaviors, and teachers always acting as facilitators. So it goes beyond the objective. It focuses on the primacy of direct experience of this interrelationship. It's concerned with processes and energies within the universe. It deals in systems of relationship and their application to the life of the community, so there's that practical piece. And this idea that science cannot divide its application into departments. It is integrated into the whole of life and being and provides a basic schema and basis for action. So, Kokopelli was a Southwest symbol. You know, for us, you know, Kokopelli is although you know you see him and he's kind of the icon of Southwestern things Southwestern. Okay, so you can see him in, you know, shower curtains at Walmart, or on you know in all kinds of shapes and forms, because he's been commoditized. You know, he's the symbol of the Southwest. But for Pueblo people, he's the essential. I guess I would say the procreative spirit of nature itself that resides in every one of us, you know, in the sense that this is that spirit that drives us to create, and also is the creative energy that you see in growing plants, or in playing children, or a variety of different expressions of that creative spirit. So that's what Kokopelli is, you know, and you can find Kokopelli all the way from just below Alaska all the way to Central and South America. Kokopelli is a symbol that is known. So let's see, I think I got that already. I guess what I want to say about that is so we don't have a word for education in most native languages, and probably the best way to describe how native peoples traditionally viewed education, what we call education today, was a coming to know. So it's a process, a coming to know. And but that coming to know, or coming to understand, metaphorically entails a journey, a process, a quest for knowledge and understanding. And there is a visionary tradition involved with these understandings that encompass harmony, compassion, include hunting, growing, technology, spirit, song, dance, color, number, cycle, balance, death, and renewal. So these are the characteristics that you can find in almost any indigenous culture. If you study the history of those cultures, you'll find intimations of all of these thoughts and these ideas. And I think the great misunderstanding between Western science and what I call native science is this idea that there's only one kind of way to do science. And I think that's also based on the Western focus on material objective thinking. That's the axiology of Western worldview. So the material becomes the whole cheese, you know. And I think that part of the things that have to happen in science as a whole, science in the big picture, including all of us, indigenous and non-indigenous, is there has to be a balance that has been reestablished. The Greeks knew it and understood it. You know, they had their philosophy of science, but they also had that science contexted in the philosophy of balance, overall balance. And so it was in the Western tradition at one time. And I think that we have to really seriously look at that philosophy of science once again, you know, and it's coming. It's, you know, ecologists, eco-philosophers are actually talking this way. So it's not just Greg Cajete, you know, spouting off these thoughts. I mean, it's in the literature, it's in the research, it's in the formations of many ecological philosophers around the world that are saying similar kinds of ideas, that we've got to change this paradigm that has us on this path. We have to begin to be more inclusive. And we know that in any natural community, the strength and the resilience of that community is depending on its diversity of plants and animals and soils. That's what gives it its strength. And the same thing is true with human knowledge systems. So I just want to sort of finish with telling you that it's important for us to once again begin to look at this and begin to find ways to bridge these two kinds of logic together in ways that are synergistic and that, in a sense, can bring us back together again in some important ways, maybe essentially for our own survival, into these next generations. So this is the paradigm that has to be addressed seriously. It's been avoided, and institutions like this and mine are vested in the old paradigm of doing things as usual, the corporate model, the business model, but it's not the ecological model. It's not really the people model. It's really something that has to be seriously addressed. So I think I'm going to stop there because this was actually much longer than I thought. I really got into it. Let me get to the last of it here. So after saying all this, the other few slides were getting into, why is this, why are we in such conflict with Western science and all those kinds of things. But I'll finish with this because I know the time is coming closer to the end. But for me, it's really that there is this is a very interesting time of transformation. So it's not only in climate change. Okay, it's really societal change and being stimulated by, I think in this case, climate change. But our population is going to be 9 billion in a very short time. We are right at the edge of the carrying capacity of the Earth. We are looking at not only degradations of key ecological systems, all over the world, but the possible collapse of some of those systems in the very, very near future. And we're like those lemmings, We're running. We know that we have a feeling that there's a precipice there, but nonetheless we're running full speed ahead, towards that precipice. And someone in that herd has to say, "Let's go this way, let's go that way, but let's not go over that precipice," And I think it's really a very sobering time. It's not only a challenge of climate change; it's also a challenge of how we begin to educate, learn from each other, from this point on. So there's some quintessential issues that we have to address in education first, and they all have to do with a relationship, balanced relationship. First of all, how are we going to relate in a better, more holistic way with the natural world, which is the ecological dilemma. And then the other piece to that is how are we going to relate to each other, which is the multicultural dilemma, in a better and more holistic and more sustainable way. And in the middle of that is the spiritual dilemma. How are we going to develop the consciousness necessary to bring those two dilemmas into some sort of balance with each other? That's why this whole, I was just reading on the growth of mindfulness, and especially in the developed countries. Believe it or not, mindfulness has become huge. It's a huge industry now. You have multiple expressions, but it's also a kind of movement, in terms of educating ourselves, about our inner selves, and then, extending that into our relationship to each other and to the natural world. So it may be happening anyway, and I think in some ways, as educators and people who are involved in educational institutions or students, we have to be not only cognizant of that, but hopefully conscious enough to help that along. And so that new sun is upon us, and a new cosmology is being born. You know, whether it's going to be born in time to address the issues, I don't know. How will we collectively greet it is up to us. We may embrace it, we may ignore it, we may cringe in fear of it, but it will rise to take its rightful place in time. You know, and we as Native people have prophecies that, you know, we are in that time. You know, we've had prophecies about this. So, dawning of a new sense, a new sun, an indigenous sense of place. And I guess I want to leave us with that. So ultimately, you know, the word indigenous is interesting because it's problematic in a lot of ways, but I use it anyway. And in Native studies, we're always having these debates about terminology, so we've gone like through 5 or 6 iterations of different terms. Indigenous is... But, you know, the essential meaning of indigenous is that we are of a place. And at the broadest level of conceptualization of what it is to be indigenous is that as human beings, we are indigenous to the earth. And this is our place. And so at that level, that big level, taking all the politics out of it, you know, we are all indigenous in the sense of being a part of this earth and also a part of this place. So as you think about what this means, think about your own role in the context of the roles and the roles and the kinds of things that you want to do, you know, to either support or not support, you know, this movement, this new sun coming into being. Because it's happening, whether we know it or not, whether we think it's happening or not, whether we believe it's happening or not, it's happening. Yeah. So I leave you with those sobering thoughts. Thank you so much. As we say, Wikun Da'an, thank you very much for sharing your breath. I'm ready for some questions.
I'd like to take a moment also to thank you and provide you this gift from our Native American Cultural Center.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate
Thank you
coming out.
Dominique.
And the insights we're sharing. Looking forward to what grows from what we're all collectively learning and taking back with us here.
Thank you.
So can we continue to use this room for some Q&A?
Yeah, we'll have this room until 6 o'clock, and we invite everybody to stay. And if you're hungry, you can get some hot food just across the hall here, and breakfast too. We have both of these rooms until 6 p.m., so you're welcome to mingle here, but mostly eat in there. But yes, we have these 2 rooms.
And I do have about 5 copies of Ignite the Sparkle and Look to the Mountain that I want to have to lug back on the plane. So if you're interested, you know, I do have some copies available. And oh, thank you so much. That's beautiful. But yeah, I'm open for some questions. If some of you have questions that you want to ask.
I'm not sure who's monitoring the chat. If people are asking questions online also.
They're usually not asking questions, but if you do get a question, just we'll ask you to repeat it so
Okay.
we can hear it. That's all.
Okay.
If not, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you want to start over here? I see a couple over here.
Yeah.
So we'll start.
So one of your slides, you mentioned stages of the initiation to knowledge.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, really it's not so much as a question as just ask for more clarification. I think that that's a really interesting idea. I mean, I'm not fully certain it was just that one mention, so, because it seems like in the Western tradition, initiation to knowledge would just be the cumulative effect of the content. It's like first you start with basic principles and then you build from there. But especially some of the ethical mandates that you've listed as well might entail that some of the stages of initiation, especially on the part of the students, might be that maybe some sort of character requirement that we would be attentive to that attunement to moral mandates or something like that. So again, it's more just a question of the stages of initiation to knowledge.
Well, all indigenous societies, have protocols that are followed, with regard to initiations when you're ready. It kind of has to do with what we call scope and sequence in science, where, okay, you start with these principles, and then, next grades you get these principles, other grades you get the other principles. And the idea is, that's a very simplistic way of putting it, but that's kind of initiation to knowledge based on readiness. But the readiness was determined by this all happened in a communal context, so people who knew whether you were ready or not, or you would ask to be, initiated to a certain level of knowledge or body of knowledge, or certain society that had knowledge that you wanted to be a part of. And so you had to go through a process of learning, of understanding, of being ready for mature rise, and also in terms of wisdom, ready to move to the next stage. And of course, this is one of the most ancient forms of knowledge transmission. It occurred in all cultures all over the world, through time. And for Native people, that was kind of the case. Now, in a contemporary sense, we've kind of changed that into what we are in education today. So you go through now, pre-K, pre-K, and then K, and then your elementary, and then your junior high and high school, and then undergraduate, and then graduate, and then finally you're at some stage, So there is already a kind of recognition that there are stages to knowledge accumulation and knowledge development and maturity, readiness. But it's not ceremonialized, nor is it contextual, as it would be in a Native community. And I think those are the things that are missing once again, is that yeah, you can gain a PhD, but if you don't have the wisdom to go with it, then that's problematic. Okay, so if that hasn't been incorporated somewhere in your journey, in your initiations, and hasn't been a focus of those initiations, then you may not make very good decisions, or make very bad decisions, but good science, So there's a very interesting kind of process to be had. So reintroducing this sense of initiation into how you learn science, I think, is something that could be explored. And I think is important in some ways, Are people ready for certain kinds of knowledge? Yeah.
I can't remember exactly the word you used, but when you were talking about kind of the Western point of view, you said something like objectiveness or objective, kind of an objective viewpoint. Could you expand a little bit more by what you mean by that, and how it kind of, where the kind of more indigenous view conflicts, where the conflict is?
Well, I guess I should say, I'm objective, and I know a lot of indigenous people are objective, actually, maybe even more so than you would realize. But that objectivity is also contexted within a broader base of knowledge and understanding. So it's not just a focus on just that specific. It's not reduction oriented objectivism. It's not just. It considers the context and the different kinds of variables, or the different kinds of entities that would affect that objectivity. So it's a objectivity I don't know if one can say there's a holistic objectivity, but it's more holistic in terms of its orientation. So in other words, you consider many more factors than simply what you're looking at that moment, you know. And so that's what makes it contextual, you know. So my mentor and dissertation chair was Edward T. Hall. You know, he was famous for his work in anthropology, communication, diversity, multicultural education. And he created the term low context and high context cultural communication. So read Edward T. Hall, and he puts science into one of the lowest context communication forms, especially the way it's taught in universities. So in low context means it's very reductionist, very focused. And high context thinking is where many variables are being considered at the same time as you're considering whatever you're looking at. Yeah, or many things are happening simultaneously to one event. So nothing is really just isolated, but it's always connected, and those connections are always recognized. Yeah. Yes?
You spoke a bit about a dynamic, multidimensional harmony as a perpetual state of the universe. And I was curious how that state responds to perturbations or restructures itself in the presence of disharmony.
Well, it's always in flux. Of course, you know, quantum theory says we're always in flux, and you know, nothing is ever static, nothing is ever in place. And so, but there's which is really the crux of the issue, is we don't really understand what brings in what kind of maintains the order in the midst of all this chaos, because the logic would be that if things get too chaotic, they just kind of like become scattered, and you can never put them back together again. But there's a force, there's an energy, there's something that yeah, it allows for that flux to happen, but also allows for it to come back together in new kinds of variations or new kinds of formations. So that's one of the big questions that you know, people at CERN, you know, in Switzerland are trying to figure out in terms of particle physics. You know, what is that force that keeps things moving in spite of all the chaos? We call it the great mystery, because maybe maybe we're a part of it, but maybe you know, our brain is not ready to really fully comprehend that mystery, you know. So, but we accept it as being a mystery at this point. So that's the great mystery phenomena among Native people. That's the way we describe it. I don't know if that answers your question.
I guess I'm kind of curious if, from the Native science perspective, if the tendency is to return to its original state, or if it's to redistribute itself into a constantly changing, always different state, or is it more of a tendency to return to kind of a very steady, you know, no matter what happens? Is that maybe
like a gyroscope? Yeah. I think both processes are inherent in, you know, there's a recognition that things return to balance, but at a new order or a new configuration. So one can say that that constant change is constantly happening, reordering into new states of equilibrium, and then they equalize and move into a new state, but then come back together again. You know, so that's the way I understand it at this point in terms of how science would describe it. But we really don't know.
Sure, yeah.
But we really don't know, you know, because that's why we're thinking about how does it really happen, and there are a lot of theories and possibilities, and they're being tested, but you know, none of them seem to really grasp the essence of what's really happening there. So that's the mystery. Yeah.
Do you feel that there is enough recognition that Native peoples, Indigenous peoples are kind of the founders of the field of ecology?
Well, we do, you know, because our philosophy is an ecological philosophy. I can say that Indigenous peoples, you know, certainly have developed that kind of thinking. But as I said before, it was also a part of Western tradition up to a certain point in time. So it was a part of natural, what we call natural philosophy. You know, it gave birth to what today in the Western tradition is called science. But in earlier times, it was called natural philosophy. So it was there too. Yeah. So I should say something about the practical aspects. So Indigenous peoples, because of colonization, you know, and because of the devastation of colonization, that's the other book, Community, you know, we lost tremendous knowledge systems, and much of the enterprise of Indigenous peoples has been to, first of all, relearn that history, reclaim it, in some cases, remember it, or bring it together in some kind of new configuration, or you know, start to use that as a basis for new creations, new iterations of Native science. So Native peoples in the enterprise of Native studies, you know, which is involved with Native scholarship, Native methodologies, Native research, is attempting to create new paradigms that include the Indigenous voice and that include the Indigenous viewpoint and perspective. And so that's kind of the work of Native studies, you know, and Native studies is inclusive of all the things that Native people are doing in all of the disciplines. In some way or another, it's a reconstruction and a remembering, which begins with learning your cultural history, but then okay, so once you know that history, which is dismal when you look at colonization, but then and its effects, but then how do you recover? How do you move beyond that and begin to reconstruct, you know, the Indigenous mind? So I call it the Indigenous mind rising because it's happening in the field of Indigenous studies all over the world. You know, literally all Indigenous people all over the world are involved with cultural revitalization, decolonization. And so it's a very exciting place to be, actually, in its infancy in the Western context of academia. Yes.
So, what does a decolonized or a eco-economy look like? Because a lot of the way that we've structured the economy has been based on Western scientific dichotomies, and so what's that relationship between an economy and a philosophy that's decolonized?
Well, economy comes, you know, from the Greek word household, you know, so economy has to do with how do you sustain your household, your place, and you're working within that place. I think that there is enough work among eco-philosophers and eco-economists, you know, that there's a movement in this direction. But the central issue is that bottom line profit motive. You know, I have another presentation that's on Indigenous sustainability where I use the, you know, how should you shift the focus from, and this is what I talked about and we did in Bhutan, how do you shift the focus from gross national product, which is the bottom line, to gross national happiness, which is sustaining humanness, you know, in relationship to the natural world. And so the economies of that really deal with de-emphasizing the monetary orientation of economy and looking at the communal orientation and communal good and well-being as being the ultimate bottom line, which is inclusive of the natural environment. So not just a human-based thing anymore. So again, it's a movement towards the indigenous thinking, again. So that's the way I would describe it. I mean, so, and actually, truthfully, it is possible. It is possible to do that. You're finding the local, local economy movement, is moving absolutely in those directions. You find it going on in a variety of different contexts, but usually outside mainstream institutions. It's not happening in mainstream institutions. So I guess I would say it's happening, but because it has to, but the institutions haven't caught up to this, but trying to look green and to be green but unless you change your philosophy of economy from the bottom line of focus on the monetary value of things versus human well-being, then things won't change very much. Yeah.
I have a question about the idea of education that we talked about. You said it's more, there wasn't a word for education, it's more about coming to know something. And I think one of the challenges that we face, especially in the education system as it is that our conception of knowledge is so restricted to like an empirical understanding or a purely rational basis for knowledge. And so I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on an approach to how could we talk about knowledge in another way, in a way more similar to what you were talking about in the presentation.
Well, I think that the seeds have already been planted via the eco-philosophy. And I think, those schools and those colleges that are beginning to embrace eco-philosophy as kind of the foundational guide, to what they do and how they do it and why they do it, are the ones that are going to begin to really address these challenges. So I would suggest, and I'm sure because your question alludes to that every institution that's interested in this kind of transformation begins to read, the huge body now of eco-philosophy that's being produced by scholars all over the world, along these same lines, these perspectives, because it's there. That knowledge and that perspective and those orientations are there. Not trying to evade your question, but just give you a general overview that the place to start is to begin to shift our emphasis away from that economic focus of paradigm into that ecological focus, and I think those are really the places to begin, because it's there. I mean, we have scholars, that are saying exactly the same thing that I'm saying, but in their way. And so it's there in the literature. It's just a matter of engaging that literature in a much more robust sense of engaging that literature. Yeah. Okay. I'm moving around. I'll come to this side of the room. I'm neglecting you.
About your presentation, I thought was really insightful, and I thought it was really important was when you mentioned, how Western science, there's always this focus on objectivity, and how it's important to take into consideration cultural aspects. And it just made me reflect on the fact how there's this hierarchy of where Western science is seen as the best kind of science because it's objective and rational. But I think it's so important to have that cultural aspect, because when you look further, a lot of times historically in this Western society, when people have said, oh, this is objective science, when you look further into it, it was actually rather biased.
Yes.
Because of their own culture.
Yeah.
When there was that whole idea of eugenics, for example, that was considered science. Like, oh, certain human races are superior to others. And they claimed that it was rational. So I feel like this indigenous and native way of thinking can prevent us from making those same mistakes and pretending like we're being truly objective when I think that's a very hard thing to achieve, true objectiveness. And like by acknowledging, no, there's this cultural aspect, I think we can do better science that way. So thank you. I don't know. That's what made me think about it.
Well, one of the authors I researched, his name is Jeremy Hayward. And he challenges what he calls the myth of scientific objectivity head on, he says. And that's where when I say humans are humans, and we are all subjective. So objectivity in science is reducing our subjectivity to the lowest possible level, but it's still there. Human and subjectivity is still there. So the notion is to reduce your subjectivity to as little as possible, but the fact is that you're never going to get rid of it. Objectivity then becomes a kind of construct that really is not achievable. As far as humans are concerned, we are always going to have subjectivity in whatever we do and whatever we think and how we think. But so the scientific method allows just that you can use that as a tool to reduce your subjectivity. But there's so many contextual factors that impact true objectivity that it's almost unachievable. Yeah, it's really in some ways a myth. Yeah.
Well, this is similar, but not quite. But I wanted to kind of comment to the students particularly that there is a small revolution going on in the world. I think we've kind of started to realize that high production, high use efficiency it has its consequences.
Yeah.
There are people out there that are starting to look at how to diversify the things that they do
Yeah.
in the agriculture world and the forestry world to make that diversity a
Yeah.
little bit more appreciated. And I think there is more interest in community-based collaboration with the people that live there.
Yeah. No, I see that too. I mean, compared to, let's say, 40 years ago, I see that too.
A little inch, but I think it's out there.
It is out there. You're right. Absolutely, you're right. I'm just egging it on. I'm saying.
Yeah, you have a long ways to go. That's exciting with all you young people, is that perhaps you can carry that down.
Yeah. Well, I hope I've shared you some thoughts and ideas that'll give you food for thought, and I actually cut off a whole bunch of the presentation, if you may have noticed, That's what was getting to some of the questions that you guys are asking, particularly. So, but time was getting short, so I wanted to make sure that I got through that. But in this book, Ignite the Sparkle, back in my days when I was, in the classroom and working with students in a high school context, I created a curriculum that tried to begin to bring in the indigenous thought with the science, Western science, and build bridges between the two. And what I called it bicultural science at that time. And it worked pretty damn well. Actually, it worked pretty damn well. What I found was that the institutional structures, including native schools, because we have to, because of federal funding, we have to look like a Western school, and accreditation and all these kinds of things, really prevented the full development of these kinds of curriculum. Because you're actually dealing with worldviews around which institutions are based, and so I found that the students went wild for this kind of teaching and learning, the bicultural native science, Western science, native science, Western science. But the institutions couldn't deal with it. They just weren't ready for it. They always would revert back to, normalized science. So this is the interesting kind of dilemma, is that there are a lot of creative science people and doing creative science and doing bicultural science, but the institutions are not set up to handle that or to really even propagate that. So when I wrote the book and did the work with my students, I realized that this model was before its time. This is like, what started as junior, senior high school and then into the first and second year of college. So one would call it like a survey of science, but the model itself is adaptable higher up or further down, depending on where you want to enter it. Yeah. So that's why I focus on curriculum design, because you can actually design for these outcomes to happen. It's just that the institutions, because of a lot of issues, accreditation and how departments and disciplines are sort of laid out, don't allow for much of this to happen. And that's unfortunate.
That connects to a question I had. In terms of these institutions, whether or not they're schools or government's policy, what do you think are effective tools to kind of support that change in those institutions? Is it activism? Is it teaching? Is it, good quality science?
It's all of those.
All of them.
All of them, absolutely. It's a multi-dimensional approach that has to, so just one thing by itself tends not to be that successful, but multiple kinds of levels of challenging that system and challenging it to change, including policy and politics, which now predominates, in terms of its actual impact. But people are doing this. This is happening all over the world. It's not uncommon to find people all over the world engaged in some act of creating new forms of education, integrating different forms of science in ways that are sustainable and that they can work with. The whole sustainability movement outside the university is doing this. People in Hawaii, you go to Hawaii and you see how the Hawaiians have recaptured or reclaimed their traditional forms of sustainable agriculture and now are reapplying it in a contemporary sense, using science, using good science to enhance and extend that. And you find that true among many indigenous people around the world doing the same thing. So it's very possible, it's happening already.
We have some refreshments, and I just want to give Dr. Cajete an opportunity to
Thank you.
refresh himself. And then I encourage you to come and purchase his book if you want to continue to learn more. The social is continuing in room 142. I think it's just across the hall. So one more time, let's thank Dr. Cajete.
Thank you.